Havadai todos, naonhusi Marina Tyquiengco. Good evening, everyone. My name is Marina Tyquiengco, and I'm the Curatorial Assistant in the Contemporary Art Department at the MFA. We are so glad you are here with us. My co-organizer, Martina Tanga, and I thank you for joining this program, Community Crossroads, Boston Native, Black and Native Experiences in Boston, in connection with Garden for Boston, the outdoor installation. This is the second in a series of 3 conversations focused on Black and Native histories of people and place. Next slide, please. Although we are in a virtual space, we would like to acknowledge that the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, founded in 1870, stands on the historic homelands of the Massachusetts people, a site which has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among different nations. As a museum, we acknowledge the long history of the land we occupy and seek ways to make indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and spaces. I would also like to add that I'm in Providence, Rhode Island, a place traditionally stewarded by the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples, many of whom still call this place home. And we can learn more about the Massachusetts people who continue to be stewards of this land by visiting massachusettstribe.org. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of tonight's program, and we'd also like to acknowledge our funders. Garden for Boston is generously supported by the Carl and Ruth Shapiro Family Foundation, with additional generous support from an anonymous donor. Funding for programming is provided by the MFA Associates and MFA Senior Associates. Next slide, please. So the Garden for Boston installations are growing and currently underway in the front entrance of the museum. And next, we have a very short teaser video so that the artists can tell you all about their projects.
Monuments. I wanted to reintroduce a Wampanoag presence into Boston. It's very strange as a Native person in modern times to walk through Boston and not see a single reflection of myself or my culture. The sunflower is known to break up clay, soil, rocky soil to find nurturing and strength to grow. I wanted something that was going to bring life and liveliness and motion and fluidity in a large way, and corn does that. I thought that the Sunflower Project could be a monument to Roxbury. It's my love letter back to my community.
So thank you for being with us. I know that the video is a little bit off when we share it, but it makes me just so excited for Garden for Boston to hear about it from the artists themselves, and also for our final online event in this series on June 22nd from 5 to 6 p.m., planting together a conversation with Equa Holmes and Elizabeth James Perry. So just a little housekeeping before I hand it over to my colleague to do introductions and get us started. This program is being recorded and will be made available later this summer on YouTube. Only our panelists are visible and audible throughout this event. Your video and audio is disabled, but we will hear from you, comments and questions, through the chat and Q&A function. So please feel free to drop questions in as people are talking, and we'll get to them either right after or at the end. Lastly, a transcript and closed captions for this program are available through Rev for Zoom live captions. We thank our colleagues Nadia Hardin and Sophia Walter for their logistical support. Sophia is providing technical support for today's program via the chat functions. And we really welcome your feedback on this panel, as well as your input regarding future online programming at the MFA. Your responses significantly help in the development of programs for educators and all audiences. And now on to my colleague, Martina, who will introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have next slide, please. Great. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you this evening 3 brilliant speakers. First, we will hear from Mary McNeil, Mashpee Wampanoag, who will speak on her current research on Black, Native, and Afro-Native claims to space in Massachusetts. Mary is a PhD candidate at Harvard University. And she has also been an incredible thought partner in creating this program, and we are so grateful to her collaboration. Next, we will hear from Dr. Tiffany Lethabo King, an associate professor at Georgia State University in African American and Women and Gender Studies departments. She is the author of many articles and the book Black Shoals, which is powerful documentation exploring monuments, maps, films, and novels through the lens of combining diasporic Black studies and Indigenous studies. And last but not least, we will hear from Professor Mwalim Morgan James Peters, Mashpee Wampanoag, self-describes as Mwalim da Funky Professor, an award-winning musician and composer, playwright, and associate professor at UMass Dartmouth. He is the founding member of the Groovalotus, the Grammy-nominating soul funk blues band, and he is also the author of Mixed Medicine Bag, a book of tales from his Wampanoag and Bajan cultures. So without further ado, I want to welcome Mary to the platform.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. I'm still a little bit new to Zoom, even though we've been using it for a little bit of time now. So hi, everyone. And thank you so much for having me. First, I wanted to just thank, Marina and Martina and the rest of the crew at the MFA for putting on this truly beautiful series. And I'm so excited in seeing the garden that will kind of be the culmination of the series of events. It's also truly a privilege and a pleasure to be in conversation with Professor Peters and Professor King. They are two scholars whose work I just have such an immense amount of respect for. Their intellectual pursuits have really largely inspired and emboldened my own work as a student and, God willing, as a future colleague. So before I talk about my dissertation and public history work, I just wanted to take a little bit of time just to run through what kind of my own sort of personal theory of history is and what really brought me to the historical profession in the first place. So to put it most plainly, I believe that the past is usable. And by this, I mean two things. First, I subscribe to what we might call a materialist vision of history, meaning that I believe that the conditions of previous moments, they have everything to do with our present moment. They have such an immense amount of bearing on the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. And second, I really believe that we have everything to learn from the past, from what historian Robin D.G. Kelly calls the freedom dreams of the individuals who came before us and who dared to dream really that another world is possible. So these political visions from our ancestors, from our elders, and from our mentors alike, I believe they brought in our conceptions of political possibility in the present moment. And they really elucidate the stakes of what exactly it is that we're fighting for. And here I'd be really remiss if I didn't also mention, my interest in this period has everything to do with my own family history and stories that my mom told me about growing up, in the 60s and the 70s, coming of age as an Afro-Native woman in Massachusetts, spending time in two different communities, in Mashpee and on the Vineyard, also spending time as a community organizer in New Bedford. It always really kind of amazed me that I had this mom who was so sort of like politically tuned in, and I've really learned so much from our conversations over the years, and this is what really kind of made me interested in the period that I work on. So leading from this vision of history, my dissertation, it examines Black, Native, and Afro-Native actors' political claims to space in Massachusetts during the Black Power, Red Power era. So that's roughly, I'm looking at the years from 1967 to 1979. And with it, I seek to think about how organizers, activists, and community members conceived of space as sort of central to the fights for Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty. Contestations over access to space, the right to remain, they're really this consistent through line in Black and Native political thought and action during this period, especially when we're thinking about in urban spaces, how much cities such as Boston or other cities in the United States, they were kind of reconfiguring, right? Spatially and also demographically during this period, through things like suburbanization, white flight, massive sort of urban renewal projects, right? That are oftentimes sort of further spatially disenfranchising residents of large urban centers. So thus, I argue that the many space-taking and placemaking projects of both Black Power and Red Power, they were in response to centuries of colonial, municipal, state, and federal policies that sought to render Black and Native people and Black and Native communities as what Catherine McKittrick calls ungeographic, right? Not really having any real ties to space and thus dispossessable and displaceable, which we know is a lie, but that's the sort of general ethos, I argue, of many of the policies that the people that I think about were responding to. So my dissertation, it's sort of driven by the following questions. The first is, what meanings did Black, Native, and Afro-Native peoples assign to Massachusetts in the decade preceding the US bicentennial? What critiques did they proffer of the state as a crucial site in the development of an anti-Black settler colonial nation? How did these groups seize upon the era's movements for Black self-determination and Indigenous sovereignty to make claims to space and cities? And where did these geographical critiques and spatial claims enable the potential for solidarities to emerge? And also, where might they have created certain spaces of contestation? So in sort of attending to these questions, I'm really seeking to place Black Power and Red Power into conversation with each other. I'm seeking kind of break down the boundary where we might think of them as two sort of discrete movements and really think about the similarities and spaces of overlap. I'm also seeking to center the labor of Black, Native, and Afro-Native women who are integral to these movements, theorizing these women, as Kim Tallbear writes about the women at the helm of contemporary Black and Native American social movements as, quote, sharing ground in their caretaking of their peoples and their kin, end quote. So thus far with my research, with my dissertation research, I've primarily engaged in archival research. I'm looking at a lot of local archives, such as the City of Boston Archives and the Roxbury Community College Library Archives. However, there's really only so much that the archive can reveal. And because of this, I'm in the very preliminary stages of beginning to collect oral histories to sort of really make my project that much richer. So while my dissertation, it focuses on the 20th century, I am also really in love with public history work. And that public history work has examined and thought about Black and Native histories and intersections much more longitudinally. So as a research assistant for the African American Trail Project at Tufts University, I work on a community-driven public history project that maps sites of African American, African diasporic, and Afro-Native relevance across Massachusetts. Right now, I think we have over 230 sites that are sort of placed on our map. Most of them, or a good deal of them, are recommended by community members who write in, and we also have partnerships with other organizations across the state. I'm also a scholar in residence for the Framingham History Center, and in that position, I'm currently working on a cross-collection finding aid that identifies materials in the center's collections that are relevant to Black and Native life in 17th and 18th century Framingham. This work has been so deeply meaningful to me. It has enabled me to collaborate with numerous organizations, community members, and community stakeholders, really. It's really allowed me to learn more deeply about the place where I am and where my ancestors are from. And it's also allowed me to think about the persistence of Black and Native intersections and alliances across time in the Northeast. When I think about them, these intersections, I can't help but think about a line from Professor King's book, The Black Shoals, where she asserts that indigenous genocide and the enslavement of African persons, quote, do not have an edge. While the force of their haunt has distinct feelings at the stress points and instantiations of Black fungibility and Native genocide, the violence moves as one, end quote. So my work as a historian, both in my dissertation research and in my public history work, I'm really seeking to kind of contend with the persistence of certain forms of anti-Black and anti-Native violence across time, while also, paying tribute to the enduring resistance and survivance, really, of Black, Native, and Afro-Native people across the Northeast. So I think I am on time, maybe slightly over, so I will just stop there.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was so great. I think, we had some really general questions that you helped develop, but I think that you answered them, and I really appreciate how it was so personal and also so theoretical, right? Like you really brought us into that. So I wonder if maybe before we move on to Tiffany, you could just say, you talked a lot about your archival work, and I'm wondering if there are specific kind of documents or items where those Afro-Native intersections show up in the archive.
That's a really great question. So I can definitely talk about this more in terms of earlier periods, because I think, I think it's really unique being an Afro-Native person and thinking about, historical Afro-Native intersections in the Northeast, because it is very well documented, right? Some of the sort of, largest or most sort of persistent figures in broader American history, right, are oftentimes Afro-Native folks. So thinking about someone like Crispus Attucks, who is an Afro-Native man. He was enslaved in what is today referred to as Framingham. His father was an enslaved man of African descent, and his mother was a Native woman. It's really funny talking to some of the folks who I work with. We're not exactly sure what or which tribes, because it could be more than one she was from, but she descended from people in the praying town of Natick. And so here is this person who, has taken up a very particular meaning in, broader sort of American history, who's right here. We are trying to find more things about him. I think oftentimes it's a little bit difficult, particularly thinking about that early period, because so much of the colonial record was written for very particular reasons. Very particular reasons that were meant to sort of elide or sort of hide these connections, but they're there if you poke. And what I think about doing that work, I really think of someone like Jean O'Brien, who has written so extensively about Native nations in the US Northeast, and particularly talked about the ways in which these historical alliances and really blendings of communities have come to happen and come to exist.
Great, thank you so much, Mary. And I think that also gets to a kind of point that's a big guiding principle for this whole kind of series, is that Black and Native histories are American histories, that American history can't exist without them. And it's really, important and does a disservice to broader history to not focus on them and not focus on the brilliant people who are doing that work. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Martina, I believe, and then on to Tiffany. Thank you so much.
Great. Yes, I just want to introduce Dr. Tiffany King to the stage. So go ahead. Feel free to share your screen. You've got a few things for us.
Sorry about that. I thought I'd opened my PowerPoint. Okay, so Marina, thank you so much for the invitation to be in conversation with the Museum of Fine Arts at Boston, and also my colleagues, Mary and Walim. Mary, you are speaking, oh my gosh, my love language. I love your work at the intersection of Black geographies, Black and Native political thought. I'm really excited for your work and what it's gonna bring to the conversation. It's really exciting. I hope to celebrate with you when the dissertation is done. I today am coming from the ancestral lands of the Muskogee Creek. I'm in what we now call Atlanta. I also learned while I was here that both of my paternal and maternal lines of folks were enslaved in the Muskogee Creek territory by white settlers. So it is a return home in many different ways. And I don't have much connection to the landscapes in Boston, except through my work, and particularly one chapter that I'm going to talk about briefly. But the invitation, Marina, also introduces me to the work of Akua Holmes and Elizabeth Perry, which I'm really grateful for. I think that their aesthetic interventions and their aesthetic resistance was something that also haunted my own research in the Black Shoals. And I think that the creation of a garden and the ways that Perry was talking about the vitality and the livingness of earth and the ecological pushback to, I think, Dowland's perhaps well-intentioned appeal to the Great Spirit is an important way to actually push back when even liberal humanists, white liberal humanists, settler impulses have good intentions, but they still end up capturing the other, right? And standing in for the human that can represent human life and human others, right? And I've always been interested in aesthetic practices that push back at that. And one way that I think that some of my work in the Black Shoals resonates with the project of Holmes and Perry a bit is in what is the first chapter of my book, where I look at some actors. They're not necessarily artists. I don't know that they're trained artists, but I look at some aesthetic resistance of people who actually tagged the Columbus statue in Boston, the North End waterfront that I have yet to visit. And also trace a bit a kind of tradition of confronting and actually resisting this particular representation of the human, right, that works to actually become human through the annihilation of Black and Indigenous life. So even in 2005, 2006, allegedly Indigenous actors and activists beheaded it. You know, it's been beheaded a few times. When George Floyd was murdered, it was beheaded again. So this particular monument or representation of life, or the epitome of the human, what Sylvia Wynter calls man one, is a site of attack in both Black and Indigenous traditions of resistance here. And I can't wait to read more of Mary's work on these kinds of shared political theories and political lines of thought within Black and Native traditions. So I think that this kind of aesthetic practice, even defacement, even the toppling of monuments that work to set the public imaginary in a certain kind of way, are really important aesthetic moves, right? Even though we don't know the particular backgrounds of these actors, they're still pressing on aesthetic sensibilities, or what we think of if we think about Jacques Rancière's work, what is sensible, normative, even desirable, right? And then I had the opportunity to think with a Jamaican Canadian artist, Charmaine Lurch, who is reimagining Sycorax, right? Who comes up as this rather grotesque figure in Shakespeare's work as this haunt, but reconfigure Sycorax in her own wiring as both Black and Indigenous, right? And I actually position Charmaine Lurch's work at the end of my book in opposition to the monument or cenotaph of Columbus, right? She does like a counter monument work to think about the ways that we can render and represent Blackness and indigeneity in relationship to one another, right? So the human is always relational and changing and moving and in revision. And so she creates a form that evokes movement and dance even. And so it was wonderful to get to think about Charmaine's work in relationship to Holmes and James Perry's work in relationship to the kinds of monuments that are constructed by a white settler order. So I'm so grateful to be with you and now to engage you more and also listen to Mwalim.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. That was so great. And in reading your book, I was thinking about, I'm glad that you connected the Columbus statue and the work with Elizabeth James Perry and Equa Holmes and the kind of decentering of the Darwin sculpture. And I was thinking about your metaphor of shoaling. So in your book, you describe it as, it's a geographic site where land and sea meet, a kind of offshore reef area, but it also could be used as a verb of like stalling movement or like pushing up against normative flows. And the way that the Garden for Boston project inside our museum kind of curatorial practice has shoaled movement in that now, we are dependent on nature's processes for growing. That the timeline cannot be set by us, it has to be set by the forces that be. And that is kind of shoaling, like museum operations. Would you tell us a little bit more about this metaphor and how you came to it?
Yeah, no, thank you. I was writing and I was looking for a metaphor that could do something different than the shoreline. I've been thinking with the literal, right? The shore for a while, and it just wasn't feeling right because shorelines are often captured, right? They're often incorporated into nation states. And I was trying to get away from the bounded and exclusive kind of project of nation building and nation states. And I tell this story that I was finally paying attention to my own geography in a new way, right? In the ways that writers know that you're active on multiple levels, right? On a very conscious level, but also the unconscious self and self's creative parts that you feel kind of latent are always working. So in my frustration with the shoreline, something in me made me pay attention to a road that I travel every day called Flat Shoals. And I'd never paid attention to the meaning. I didn't know what a shoal was. And when I went home to do some investigation, I was like, this is perfect. This place that is often elusive, particularly when we didn't have the science of bathymetry, this place moved. It was kind of unpredictable in the way that the Caribbean philosopher Sylvia Wynter, who's invoking physics, talks about the demonic outside of a governing order. And it kind of eludes capture in a way that I was looking for. And it's also a formation that builds over time, that dissolves sometimes. And I just wanted to evoke like that kind of labor that we have to do to also track Black and Indigenous solidarity. It's not always easy. It emerges during certain moments in many of the ways that Mary is beautifully articulating, gets troubled and vexed and becomes difficult. It's a process and a relationality that is dynamic. And so the show gave me that dynamism and a way of eluding capture that the shore didn't give me. So once I found it, it just offered so much. It was so generous. So
yeah, it's incredibly rich. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll have some more questions in the Q&A, but I'm going to hand the floor over to Mwalim if you're ready. Thank you so much, Tiffany. There you are.
Good evening, everybody. Yes. My apologies. I am literally dropping off my son and his date prom right as of this minute, but I can talk to you while it's happening. And the wonderful thing is, sorry, but the wonderful thing about it is I'm in the town of Mashpee right now, in Mashpee High School's field. As you can see, the football field. Now, the significant thing about this is this property used to belong to the Fry family. They sold it to the town to, well, sold it because otherwise it probably would have been taken by eminent domain, but it became part of the high school grounds. So getting to talk about Mashpee Wampanoag right now in Mashpee works out quite well. Allow me to drop them off, but you guys have a wonderful time.
Thank you.
All right, sir. Have a wonderful time. By the way, let me show you how sharp this man looks. The young lady attending with him. Anyway, so the discussion. Black Indian, Black Wampanoag. And by the way, welcome to the effect of Black Mashpee, Black Wampanoag, because the ability to improvise and keep it moving is part of why we survive. A long discussion. Now, when we look at the history of the interaction of people of African ancestry and the Wampanoag people, there is a history that arguably goes back to the 1500s. The personal experience that I've always had was more specifically in the West Indies. And my father is Mashpee Wampanoag. And
Okay, so I think we just lost Walim. I think that maybe he's gonna be back. We're not gonna, we have some comments about not letting him Zoom and drive. We are just going to maybe bring back Mary and Tiffany to have a little kind of group Q&A before we have Walim back again, just so he has a little bit of time to maybe drive home. I think we can all agree that his son looks fabulous for his prom. And what a great way to be wished well by 150 to go off on your prom.
Oh, sharp.
Yes. Okay, so that was, I could see that was going to be such a great start, but maybe we can start back by joining each other in conversation. And I'll offer or hand it off to Tiffany or Mary in case you have questions for each other to get us started.
Congratulations, Mary. I'm so excited. When is your dissertation coming out? That's beautiful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm hoping by May of next year. So been doing a lot of yeah, it's soon. It's very soon. So it's time to really get my fingers moving on the keyboard. But that's my hope, is to defend in May. Yeah, I'm realizing that, daily, the project is changing, partially because of COVID, kind of thinking about, you know, what Professor Peters was saying about just that constant adaptation. So, you know, some chapters are changing. I'm actually really excited. I'm hoping to bring my mom's history a little bit more into the dissertation now, and hopefully having it done by next May.
So I see Mwalim's back. I thought maybe we could just do a little bit of a group Q&A in case we lose you again, Mwalim.
Okay,
Okay.
I should be good for now.
Okay.
But I guess continuing with the point I was making, what I was saying in terms of, here we go with adaptation yet again. But the experience that I grew up with was, my mother's side of the family originates from Barbados. My mother's actually first generation born in this country. And of course, growing up Mashpee Wampanoag, the experiences that I had in the dual identity, many, have been varied. And of course, in many ways, shaped a lot of my work creatively. The various experiences. One in particular, I go back to when I was in third grade. This would have been 1976. That was when the miniseries Roots was introduced. And I remember my third grade teacher wanted us to do these essays where the first was interview your mother and find out about where your family's from. So of course, do the interview with mom, and talk about Barbados and immigrating from Barbados, et cetera, and the West Indian American community and all of those kinds of points. And then the next were supposed to be about our fathers and our father's family. So then I write about my father's family. And about a week after that, now bear in mind, my mother didn't tell me this story for what happened for years, but about a week after that, it was open school night. When my mother went to open school night, my third grade teacher told my mother that I was emotionally disturbed. And when we're trying to find out, well, why is she saying that I'm emotionally disturbed? She said, because I made up this story about this Indian tribe in Massachusetts on Cape Cod, and that my mother takes me there every summer and I get to spend time with my relatives in this fictional place called Mashpee. Now, bear in mind, in the 1970s, Mashpee did not appear on the maps. In fact, if you went in some of the restaurants and diners around Cape Cod, the placemats were on maps of the Cape, and you would not see Mashpee listed. You would see Falmouth, and then all of a sudden you would see Barnstable, and there was like this big empty space that you would think was part of either of those towns. So Mashpee was an unknown entity in the 70s outside of Massachusetts, outside of Cape Cod. So this third grade teacher decided that I made all of this up. I made up this Indian tribe of Wampanoags. I made up this place called Mashpee, and I made up this uncle who was a medicine man. I made up this uncle who was the chairman of the tribal council. This was all fiction. And my mother then said to my teacher, well, no, that's actually all true. The look that my teacher apparently gave my mother indicated that she decided that, oh, I think my grandfather sent me to school and said, your teacher might find this interesting. For me years later, found out that was why he sent me with the book about the town of Mashpee, written by Amelia Bingham, that contained tons and tons of references to people named Peters, including said medicine man. So this was, you could say, the experience of the New York City public school system. And of course, there's the irony of you have schools that celebrate Thanksgiving and have everybody making, what was it, used to stuff paper bags and make turkeys and that kind of thing. So you have everybody talking about Thanksgiving that don't know the word Wampanoag, don't know the word Mashpee. So that experience. And then as you get older and begin to find the interesting points of identity, you find anti-Indian, anti-Native sentiment among Black people, and you find anti-Black sentiment among Native people, and then you find everybody trying to make you choose a side. And it even comes down to next experience I would talk about was when I took the PSAT in high school. That was the first time that I was going to actually identify myself on paper ethnically. And came to that magical phrase, ethnicity, parenthetically, choose one. And I remember getting there and raising my hand, and the proctor for the exam, a few of us had our hands up and pretty much had the same question. I remember the proctor going through the exam and telling one student, you look more Black than Puerto Rican, so put Black. You look more Latino than Black, so you put Latino. You look more white than East Indian, so just say you're white. And you can pretty much guess what he said to me. So it was like its own little built-in Ellis Island check-in, if you will, that this experience created. So that was how I became identified on paper, just simply by making that choice. And of course, it doesn't change when I get to college, when I get to Boston University. It's still the pick one, choose one. And of course, the information just goes from that paperwork to college, how this stays in your paperwork. And of course, when you get to the city of Boston and you talk to people and they find out your last name is Peters, so wait, are you related to? Yes. And that means you're related to? Yes. So that means that you're, yes. So then why are you identified as? Because I had to pick one. So pick one becomes the interesting situation. And of course, the grand change in the whole thing of pick one, and that is a rather recent, when they got rid of the pick one and just check all that apply. That became rather recent, and largely that was caused by a very, very, very strong lobby of white women with biracial children who were unhappy that they had to give up, or their child could not share their identity, if you will. So there was a movement in the 90s, again, largely by white women with biracial children. And that is why there suddenly became movement in terms of the pick one. Before that it was just, well, you're gonna be one or the other. But at that point now, all of a sudden it became, there's a possibility of being biracial. So this is where you now discover a plethora of people who are identifying themselves, no longer identifying themselves as one, and might have for like 40 or 50 years said that they were Native and are now Native and Black, or for 40 or 50 years were Black and are now Black and Native. Becomes part and parcel of the identity. Well, now, one other thing was, in terms of artistic work, storytelling is very strong in both cultural roots of my origins. Storytelling conversation among Bayesian people of Barbados, storytelling roots, etc. Obviously, the oral tradition among Wampanoag people. So growing up hearing storytelling from both sides of the family, hearing, my father was Randolph Peters was a wonderful storyteller. My uncle, Russell Peters, was a wonderful storyteller. My other uncle, John Peters, was a wonderful storyteller. We had numerous wonderful storytellers and elders in the tribe to sit and listen to. Eleanor Thaxton, the late Eleanor Thaxton, wonderful storyteller. The recently departed Ellie Peters, wonderful storyteller. So growing up hearing these people, Loretta White Jones, wonderful storyteller. Growing up hearing their stories, hearing the tales, and of course having experiences in Mashpee before the onslaught of gentrification or the secondary impact of colonization on the town of Mashpee, gave me a different sort of perspective of what Mashpee was like. And eventually becoming a storyteller myself and going out, venturing out to do stories, one of the things that happens is when people find out, oh, you're Wampanoag, yes. Oh, and this is the thing that I love, this word, authentic. Authenticity, pedigree, if you will. Can you tell us some authentic Wampanoag stories? Do you know any authentic Wampanoag folktales? And the reality is there are a lot of stories that are not meant for mixed company. There are a lot of stories that are not meant out of context, out of respect. You don't tell them. So what I started doing was making stories up. And of course, they're authentic because I'm a Wampanoag making up the story. So you can't get much more authentic Wampanoag than a Wampanoag making up a story. So when I would go to schools, when I would go to libraries and be asked to tell Wampanoag folk tales, I would. And they were folk tales that were influenced by both cultures, by both cultural backgrounds. So my, as part of the spoken word movement of the 90s, I ended up publishing a book of these folk tales, these original folk tales, called A Mixed Medicine Bag, initially as a chat book. And it was interesting because that then became a piece of literature people were grabbing up and grabbing up and grabbing up. And again, there was still the whole pedigree of authenticity called into question. Subsequently, the book was picked up and republished by Talking Drum Press. And again, I just, in the new version, explain the word authenticity and how it applies. But the Black Native experience, when you look at two people who've been divided to that point, and then when you are actually somebody who is of that divide and you're an artist, that's what kind of shapes it for you. So that, yes.
I'm so sorry. I think we need to get to the group Q&A because this event only goes till 6. I think we could all listen to you talk all evening, but I want to make sure that we get to bring you into conversation with the other folks on this call. And
I'm so sorry.
No, don't apologize. This is fantastic. We appreciate it. So I'm hoping to just ask.
One other quick piece of info I just wanted to share. Opening this coming Friday at the Watertown New Rep Theater is a play that I've written called Listen to Sipu that actually talks about the occupation of the Pequasit along the river that's now called the Charles, and the fact that it basically looks at colonization then and modern day gentrification, which is the new form of colonization, and it's running till July 11th. That was it.
Oh, great. Thank you. We'll link to that. We've been linking to kind of everything that has been said. So if we could just have Tiffany and Mary come back, and Molly, maybe we'll get started with a question for you, because I think you pointed to all the various creative endeavors that you do. You're an award-winning composer, musician, you're a playwright. You also mentioned the book you wrote. And I was wondering if you could maybe say, I picked up on Tiffany saying this really beautiful phrase earlier, aesthetic resistance, thinking about kind of using aesthetics in a way that's powerful as a means of making a point, as a means of reclamation and protest. But I just wonder if you could maybe say, or tell us like how you choose which creative form, since you have so many options when you're kind of telling a story or sharing history, how you choose to devote yourself to, say, making music or writing a play or doing a performance.
It sometimes ends up in that it ends up dictating itself to me which form to use, and sometimes I end up with cross forms. I end up writing a play that evolves into songs, or songs evolve out of the play, or vice versa. I end up writing a song that becomes a play. So I guess it's sort of like the situation or the medium dictates itself that way, just in terms of whatever feels right for it.
Great. Well, I think that we want, we have, again, Mary was a great thought partner in kind of putting this together. And it's so great to have, two people from Mashpee together with us tonight. And also, of course, the wonderful Tiffany King. So I just want to kind of open it up to see if if Tiffany or Mary have any questions for Walim or for each other. And please, to everyone on the call with us, feel free to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat.
Much. I think a question that I kind of have, I was thinking about what Professor Peters was talking about in terms of his work, like the mixed medicine bag coming up within sort of spoken word circles. And I'm also thinking about Professor King. One of the things that I really just love in that last chapter where you're talking about the Sycorax sculpture is thinking about like ritual as a place where like Black and Native folks, we can come into relationship with each other. So I kind of have a question just in terms of it's kind of it's a vague question, but just thinking about that connection between y'all's work, I'm wondering if either of y'all wanted to talk about, yeah, like the sort of communal aspect of work, or how you're thinking about Black and Native intersections and the work that y'all do.
I don't know. I want to hear Tiffany's answer first, actually.
No, thank you for that, Mary. I was trying to, and I didn't get there, trace like these Black and Indigenous ceremonies. And I started with, of course, Charmaine, who was bringing Black and Indigenous feminine form to us, right? At the scale of the human that we could walk around and engage with. But I know on my next project that's really important to me, one of the things that I want to look at as Black and Indigenous ceremony is folks involved in the Sacred Waters pilgrimage that I heard about from Colette Pichon Battle, who's a climate justice activist out of Louisiana, who took a sojourn up and down the Mississippi, started where George Floyd was murdered, and moved down to New Orleans and offered prayers with Black and Indigenous women along the Mississippi. So that kind of collaborative ceremonial work is so key. It's so key to the work that you're tracking in your own work, and what Professor Peters was talking about, and our ability to draw on each other's strength of improvisation and ceremony to actually take us into different realms of possibility and future. So I think that is so critical. It's so critical, and work I want to attend to carefully.
Beautiful question, Mary. And there's just so many really wonderful overlaps in kind of all the things that you're thinking about. Tiffany, did you have any that you wanted to ask?
You know, something came up for me when Professor Peters was speaking. I have a former student whose last name is Rollins, who's from Boston, who also has a Bayesian lineage and is Wampanoag. And I was wondering about the historical ties between people coming from enslaved folks in Barbados, traveling to Boston and making community with the Wampanoag. Like, I'm just wondering if it just was a coincidence that my students also shares that lineage, or is there a community of Bayesian people, one in Massachusetts, but also people who found community with Mashpee Wampanoag folks? Or I guess Mary and Walim.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I researched that. My personal situation, the Bayesian side was actually in New York, and they ended up visiting the Cape as tourists and decided they enjoyed it. And my parents actually met when my mother's family was looking to buy land in Mashpee. But one of the things that I found in research, now this is reaching into a different hat. I'm the grand historian for Prince Hall in Massachusetts, and the Bayesian connection obviously goes back to the slave trade. What we find is in the 1600s and the 1700s, Barbados was a major, they referred to it as a training ground for the transatlantic slave trade. So it was a stopping station. And so you had a number of enslaved Africans who came into Massachusetts and in Rhode Island came through Barbados. So that's a piece that's going from like 1695 to about the 1770s when Massachusetts does away with the trade. So you have that happening. Then during the whaling industry, you ended up with a large influx now of people from Barbados, but also this is where you ended up with a large influx of people from Cabo Verde. This happened largely 19th century and during the earlier part of the 20th century. Now, the third thing that ended up bringing a large immigrant population in the 20th century was actually the cranberry trade. You had a lot of cranberry bog workers who came from Barbados and also the Cabo Verde Islands and so forth. So you end up with this interesting cross section, and of course you end up with a large population of West Indians in general in Boston. And so, and of course you end up with a Wampanoag population. So I guess that's where you end up with a lot of that sort of cross section happening, because I believe at the last record, I think they said 82% of Boston's Black population, and when I say that, like the old school families that go back, but 82% of them actually trace their lineage back to the Caribbean. And we see this, we even see this with the late great Elmer Lewis. We see this with Minister Louis Farrakhan, and whose background is actually Barbados and Nevis. So I think that probably played as much into it, is just the fact of these were landing points.
Definitely. I think that, yeah, you can't, like Professor Peters said, like you really can't tell the story of like Black Boston without thinking about the whole diaspora, and especially the Caribbean. I mean, historically, for many reasons, there's been this really just deep connection between the Caribbean and the Northeast. A lot of it had to do with, as Professor Peters was talking about, the trade, the slave trade. Oftentimes Caribbean colonies were getting, supplies and resources, from New England, right? I remember when I was working on my dissertation prospectus, I was looking at this book. It's by, I think it's by Violet Showers Johnson. It's called The Other Black Bostonians. That's really talking about this really deep and long history of Caribbean immigration to Boston. And, like Professor Peters was saying, there are so many amazing, really visionaries like Elma Lewis, like Mel King, who are of Caribbean heritage, who have, just done so much and just truly done so much. So it's really rich. I wasn't raised in Boston. I was raised in Louisville, Kentucky. So it was really amazing when I moved back up here about 10 years ago to really just to see such a vibrant community with so many different people from so many different places, but had, really deep relationships and ties to this place. Yeah.
We're coming up to time, though we do have one question, a couple of questions actually in the Q&A and chat function. Nina Lanegra asked, Walim, speak on King Philip's War and his family sent to Bermuda after his assassination.
Oh, okay. I knew Nina would hit me with a good one. Metacomet, not King Philip.
Oh yes, sorry, Metacomet. She actually, I read it wrong. She corrected herself. Apologies.
Oh, okay, no worries, no worries. But in terms of Metacomet's War, during Metacomet's War and during the slaughter that took place, many Wampanoags from the various tribes, and as well as Pequots and Abenaki and Micmac and Nipmuc were taken prisoner and sold into slavery in Bermuda, as well as points of North Africa. So it created an interesting diaspora. But in terms of Bermuda, what happened was the people maintained their oral history and maintained their culture. So the first time making contact with folks from Bermuda who were descendants of Pequot and Wampanoag people would have been the late 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, and we're encountering our cousins who are still maintaining the culture and maintaining the history and maintaining the traditions. Similarly, because there is a certain level of acculturation that's always going to take place, but in a very similar fashion to how we practice here. And it was just fascinating to see that level of strength and also the power of the oral tradition in that regard.
Yes, and I am going to just read out a comment in the Q&A that Marcus Garvey and Claude McKay were also with Malcolm X were from the Caribbean.
Yes.
Yeah. We have arrived.
And the UNI And the UNIA was very strong in Boston.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I think that what I've learned is that this program should be longer so that we have longer to hear from all of you. Thank you again. And I just wanted to give you all a chance in case you wanted to say anything in closing before I do like the kind of MFA closing where I just need to give some information. So Mary or Tiffany or Mwalim, did you have anything that you kind of want to leave? There's so much fabulous information. I'm so glad that this will live on digitally in the future for people to kind of see and learn from.
Again, a wonderful opportunity. We should probably have another conversation like this because just as it's getting revved up, we're shutting it down. And you know, it's a very, very pleasant experience and very, very informative. Very much learned from my two colleagues. But one colleague who I can say in Mashpee is my little cousin. So.
Yes, I'm so grateful for both of y'all just to be able to be in conversation. Like I said, I just have such an immense amount of respect for both of you, and I'm really excited to continue the conversation.
Yeah, I echo both what Walim and Mary have shared. Thank you for the invitation. Wonderful to meet with y'all and be in conversation and share. So it's my pleasure.
Great. Well, thank you again. I'm just going to ask my colleague Sophia, who's hidden from all of our view, to put the PowerPoint back on just so I can close us out. And I won't take up any more of Mary, Tiffany, or Walim's time, but just again to say my biggest thank you. I appreciate all of your time so much and all of your really fabulous presentations. Like I said, this needs to just be longer so that we can have this. And I think that hopefully this will be the first and not the last conversation that we all have. Okay, so our program's coming to an end, and in the coming days, please expect an email from learning@mfa.org with a copy of evaluation form that we just introduced, and also resources that we highlighted today, which are actually a really great long list of juicy links from all of our speakers, books, and places and plays. And we welcome your feedback on this Garden for Boston program, as well as your input regarding future online programming from the MFA. Your responses will significantly help in developing programs for students, faculty, and all audience. And for those of you interested in visiting in person, the MFA is now open. And as I said, the Garden for Boston is now growing. So if you're in the area, you can come and see the corn growing. Maybe not, you'll probably see it at a certain stage of growing, but we welcome all of you to come outside and inside the museum to see our many exciting displays. So thank you again so much for joining us, and we hope to see you for our next program on June 22nd. Thank you all again.